Welcome to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. You can find show notes, how to contact me, sign up for our mailing list, and how to support the History of the Papacy by going to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. Two great ways to support the History of the Papacy are leaving your ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. And another really great way to support the History of the Papacy is by going and joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. Your support on Patreon goes a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits to you for supporting the show on Patreon. You will receive early and advertisement-free content, bonus episodes, monthly book drawings, and most importantly, you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the lists of bishops commemorated in order of their precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you'll be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William B., Brian, Christina, Sarah, William H., Augustus, Keanu, and Judy at the Alexandria level. We have Dapo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, Steve, and Sean, all of whom are magnificent at the Constantinople level and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great, Alex the Great, Amma the Great, Frederick the Great, and Geoffrey the Great. And with that, here is the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Welcome back, everyone. We've got Dr. Sean Blanchard back again, and he is going to discuss the fallout from this tumultuous council. And let's just get right to it. Some of that 25% that they didn't agree, but they also wouldn't put it on paper that they were no on the definition. Didn't they eventually split off from the church?
There were some, yes. There was a very small schism after Vatican I, and they came to be known as Old Catholics, and these they actually link up with the so-called Jansenist Church of Utrecht, which is in the Netherlands. There's a union, I believe 1889. There's a union of these groups, but they were kind of under the intellectual leadership of a professor from Munich named Ignaz von Dollinger, who was probably the most eminent scholarly opponent of papal infallibility. So you get a small group of Swiss and German Catholics who refuse to accept papal infallibility. They think it's a kind of tyranny. It's a papal tyranny that's trying to sort of crush local traditions and the true constitution of the church. So that's old Catholicism. So these parishes do exist in the United States through German and Swiss immigration. So there was one I used to live in Wisconsin. There was an old Catholic parish there. And I believe they're now in full communion, not only with the Utrecht old Catholics, but also with Anglicans. So there was a kind of small c Catholic anti-papal coalition that sort of comes together in the late 19th century.
You could say, though, that that's pretty close to a consensus if you're getting almost everybody to either fully agree to the proposal or at least just not full-throatedly disagree to the proposal.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think by 1870, the I don't know if overwhelming is probably too strong, but the firmly majority position of Catholic theologians and Catholic bishops was in favor of papal infallibility. The question really was, for most people, was how does this actually work? How do we understand this? How do we make this meaningful without taking it too far? But there really was a belief that Peter, the promises that Jesus, so the theology behind it is the promises that Jesus gives to Peter are to sort of personally protect him and his successors from error. And that is a sort of locus of teaching authority in the same sense that the ecumenical council is. And the ecumenical council is sort of, symbolically is kind of the college of the apostles. So the idea is that the Holy Spirit is given to Peter as an individual, just as it is also given to the apostolic college. And that was very, very controversial, as we've said, in the 17th and 18th century by Vatican I for a variety of reasons. I think most Catholics were either enthusiastically or reluctantly willing to affirm that.
This is such an amazing, and why I love this time period so much is we see the struggle and the push and the pull between papal secular power and this papal religious power that goes on and plays out in many different ways for over 1,000 years. And we get the wrap up pretty much right here in the 1870s. Yep, and absolutely. One influences the other. What's the immediate fallout? We know, and we've talked a lot about it in other episodes, the secular position of the Pope is essentially gone. Now he's absolutely ascendant in his religious power. Pius IX lives a few more years. What's the immediate fallout of this council?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's it causes a lot of trouble for the minority bishops. So the bishops that were anti-definition, in some cases, find it very, very difficult to govern their diocese. So especially in France, a lot of the young priests are very, very, very enthusiastically ultramontane, and they see some of their bishops as cowardly and sort of sellouts to, trying to appease kind of secular sensibility or Protestant sensibility or something like that. So it's very hard for the people who don't support this. In England and in Germany, so these are very powerful Protestant governments, or at least culturally predominantly Protestant. And there's a really tense time of sort of working out, what does this mean for the Catholic minority that lives in our nation? So I mentioned earlier Bishop Gosser, really his explanation of papal infallibility is really useful for sort of diffusing the tension in Germany. And then Cardinal Newman, John Henry Newman, he writes a very important tract called Letter to the Duke of Norfolk, which is really an answer to the Prime Minister, William Gladstone, but he writes it to the predominant Catholic nobleman. And he explains, this is where the famous line, if I have to toast, as in like an after dinner toast, if I have to toast, I'll toast to conscience first and then the Pope. So it's sort of trying to affirm papal infallibility, but not have it upset all these other important parts of Catholic moral thought, a Catholic theological thought, where at the end of the day, you're accountable to your conscience. At the end of the day, you can only do what you believe is right through prayer and through reflection and through seeking counsel, and that the Pope doesn't replace our conscience. The Pope doesn't order us to rebel against our governments or to, cheat our Protestant neighbors or what have you. So these kind of old anti-Catholic canards that you get, especially in countries like Germany and England, are really come back with a fury. And a lot of Catholic leaders feel that they have to sort of put out a number of fires. On the other hand, the centralization that this either causes or symbolizes, or probably both, really does set up Catholicism to become a kind of a truly global faith, sort of paradoxically. So there's a wonderful new book by John McGreevy called Global Catholicism from the French Revolution to Pope Francis. And he really lays this out beautifully, how Ultramontanism provides, for all of its problems and issues, it does provide a framework through which Catholicism, in a very real way, becomes a united global community. From Japan to Nigeria to California. So Ultramontanism is often a dirty word, and there are some good reasons for that, but it also there's a reason why it triumphed when it did, and it had a lot to commend it, and it did very successfully build a kind of Catholic, subculture around the world: schools, universities, communities, labor unions, etc.
Steve here again. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Chris Mowery's Vlogging Through History and many other great podcasts. Go over to Parthenon Podcast to learn more. And now here's a quick word from our sponsors. The young generation of prelates that you mentioned that are very ultramontane, and they see that some of their bishops even as sellouts. How do they evolve? I mean, we're moving into the 20th century. How do they evolve, and how does the ideals that come out of Vatican I evolve from there?
I think, that's a great question. The kind of old guard, the old Gallican, or the Holy Roman Empire had some of these figures too, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So that kind of old guard just sort of passes away eventually. But there's always a minority report in the Catholic community that is wary of what you might call popolatry, a kind of undue veneration or worship of the Pope. There are people that are worried about what we now call creeping infallibility, where maybe even a Roman congregation that has delegated papal authority is seen as infallible. So there are people that are pushing back against this. You could interpret Americanism to the extent that really existed at the turn of the 20th century as, in some ways, American resistance of Ultramontanism. You could interpret modernism in a certain sense as resisting Ultramontanism. So you always have these kind of counter narratives in Catholic history, but it really isn't until the lead up to the Second Vatican Council that you have any sort of institutionally significant critique of Ultramontanism. By the time of the Second Vatican Council, you have a huge amount of theologians and bishops who believe that Vatican I, they would affirm Vatican I. It's an ecumenical council. They aren't trying to undo it, but they're trying to balance it. They're trying to have very strong statements on the role of the bishop and also on lay people. What is the after all, lay people are 98% of the church. Cardinal Newman has that hilarious note in his diary of saying, we'd look pretty silly without them, us clergy. So there's a sense to not unsay any of the teaching of Vatican I, but rather to supplement it and to balance it with affirming other offices in the church, other roles in the church, so that the office of the Pope is not overshadowing everything.
They're really, in a way, looking to not make an absolute monarch out of the Pope, which is kind of ironic because, like you said, as we move forward, you get into the cult of personality popes.
Totally. Yeah. We're in a very kind of paradoxical age. So a lot of historians and theologians will talk about I do this myself, an age of Ultramontanism beginning perhaps with Gregory XVI in 1831, certainly by Pius IX. And then that ends, in most people's account, 1958. You get John the 23rd elected. John the 23rd is this, kind of rotund, pleasant, smiling, sort of grandpa-like figure. He calls the Second Vatican Council, which some people are shocked because they go, well, the Pope's infallible. The Pope can just he can just rule on any issue. He doesn't need voting. He doesn't need, at this time you have 2,500 bishops. What's the point of this if you have an infallible pope? And John the 23rd was asked about this, and he said, I'm only infallible when, it's kind of a tautology. He says, I'm only infallible when I speak infallibly, when I speak ex cathedra, and I'm never going to do that, so I'm not infallible. So there's this sort of devolution, if you will, a kind of the papacy is sort of willingly putting this on ice in order to try to recover a kind of conciliar, synodal form of government. But yeah, there's no question. I mean, it's very paradoxical, because Vatican II takes these steps towards consensus, not conciliarism in the medieval sense, but conciliar teaching and conciliar government. But then also John Paul II is has mass appeal, has a celebrity status that would have been unthinkable for a medieval pope. I mean, most people didn't know what the pope looked like, and some historians think a lot of lay people didn't even know what the pope's name was in most cases until the 19th century. So we certainly are in a paradoxical situation of a prestige of the papacy. People are far more likely to read what the pope says on the internet, maybe even on Twitter, than they are to listen to their local bishop or debate what their local bishop says or thinks or teaches. He's sort of an administrator to most people, whereas the pope is the sort of direct pastor. So in that sense, Vatican II, I think, is only partially successful in a kind of attempt to sort of rebalance the church's constitution.
Well, and it's so interesting too, because I don't even think that this was the case with John Paul II. Was highly respected, but I don't think people hung on every word and parsed out every word. Like, say, when Pope Francis is on the airplane and he's talking, and maybe he's just shooting from the hip too, but then that gets spread by Twitter and social media, and it becomes a whole different thing.
I think that I think you're right about that. I think the way that information can be diffused so rapidly. I mean, I'll never forget. I taught high school at a small Catholic school in North Carolina for 2 years after my master's, and I was teaching when Benedict XVI resigned. Joseph Ratzinger resigned. So it's momentous day, and I walk into school. And the students go, Mr. Blanchard, the Pope resigned. And I was like, yeah, okay, guys, like, you guys don't believe everything you read. I just assumed it was some kind of fake news thing or some, meme or something. And they go, no, he resigned this morning. And I laughed and said, guys, we covered that. I was teaching church history. I was like, guys, we covered that. That hasn't happened since. Remember, that was one of the questions. It hasn't happened since. And then the student goes, yeah, 1415, but it just happened. It just happened today. And they were right. And they knew about it before I did, because, I don't know, they got pinged on their phone as some breaking news thing, or they were listening to the radio in the car or whatever it was. But information. I mean, John Paul passes away in 2005. The last couple of years of his life, he's suffering from Parkinson's, and he's very limited. And the way that technology has changed from, say, the year 2000 to 2023 is just astronomical. I mean, I feel like I'm a different generation from my brother, who's 5 years younger than me. I feel like the way that he relates to technology and uses technology is different from me. So you're probably right that we haven't really seen anything like the Francis pontificate. And it also, he shoots from the hip. He's willing to say stuff that I think previous popes, if they had it as an opinion, they kept it private, or they spoke only to, trusted aides or something like that. So I think it's partly his style. It's partly the content, and it's partly technology.
If you had to speculate, where do you think the church, and this is pure speculation, where do you think the church is going with this? I mean, we're seeing little hints of things coming out, like the synod on synodotality, and there's definitely a swing more towards, let's not use the C word, conciliarism, but towards more group decision making. But on the other hand, we do have a pope that can tweet something out or just say something and it spreads. Where do you think that the balance is going to come through that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so we have this kind of paradoxical situation right now, where the center. So sometimes Catholic theologians will talk about the center and the peripheries, which is, I don't know, has limited use, but the center meaning Rome and the peripheries meaning the local churches. So we have this sort of paradoxical situation where the center is sort of trying to get the peripheries to self-govern in some sense. There's some sense that synodality is about, I know, of course, people would quibble with anything related to any of this, but it's some sense that there's a shared responsibility for ministry, for governance, for, taking spiritual responsibility for the church. There's some sense of that. So I frankly just don't know. To what extent can a powerful centralized figure spark more decentralized, more deliberative, more consultative leadership structures? I really don't know. One of my big takeaways from Vatican I, I've talked about, or at least I've hinted at the fact that infallibility is not necessarily the most useful of doctrines, in the sense that it's not really clear what is and isn't infallible. People still argue about it. It's not the magic bullet that some of the ultramontanists thought that it was for just solving a problem. But jurisdictional supremacy, which is also taught in Pastor Aeternus, so that's the idea that the Pope has supreme jurisdictional authority in the church. That is a very, very significant reality in the church, for better or worse. And that would just depend on the situation and the Pope. But so, for example, if my bishop were to suddenly retire or die tomorrow, Pope Francis, if he wanted, he could personally pick anybody to fill that vacancy. Nobody could do anything about it. He can change canon law. He can dispense anyone in the world from, say, abstaining from meat on St. Patrick's Day, which is a Friday in Lent. He can canonize saints. He obviously can make liturgical changes. So there's no he's the supreme legislator right now. This is the way the papal office functions. There's no sort of de jure checks and balances on any of this. There are practical checks and balances for sure, but there's no sort of constitutional checks and balances, if you will. And because of that, I'm not really sure where synodality can go unless it's consultative, ultimately. So I think a future pope could sort of undo all of this. I think what Francis is doing is admirable and good. I think that this synodal system is an ancient Christian reality that's been preserved by the Eastern Catholics and preserved by the Eastern Orthodox. I think it's beautiful and good and true. But how does it coexist with jurisdictional supremacy? I haven't really gotten a good answer of that question, and I really don't know.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. The church is probably getting pretty close to some change as well, because Francis is not young and he's not in the greatest of health. So a lot's going to probably change within the next 10 years or so, or not change potentially.
I think Francis, I think Francis probably has a couple years left, but I don't think he has a huge amount of time left. And because of that, I think his legacy is what he sees as his legacy is getting the ball rolling on synodality. And I think that's really where his heart is. And the extent to which that is or isn't successful, it's the sort of thing that really is only going to be able to be judged probably in decades from now. And it's going to depend on a lot of things Francis has no control over, which is how do local churches receive this? What interest do they have in it? And then most critically, what is the next pope, the pope after that, the pope after that? What interest do those popes have in this process? I'm of the mind, and this is pure speculation, I think we are going to get a Francis 2.0. I think the next pope is going to be very much in the model of Francis, but I don't know that means the one after that and the one after that will be. And these changes, as you know very well from looking at the whole sweep of this, one pope can be very, very different from the other and can have a very different agenda. So synodality is a noble concept, but how does it coexist with a jurisdictionally supreme papacy is the real challenge, and people don't seem to be talking about that quite as much as I think they should be. I think when people talk about Vatican I, they talk about infallibility. I frankly don't think that's as important as this question of jurisdictional supremacy. I also think that's scandalous to the Eastern Orthodox, because for the Eastern Orthodox, the concept that the Pope has immediate jurisdiction over the patriarchs, I think for them is just totally intolerable. So it's a major ecumenical problem as well.
Do you think that Francis is sort of setting up the dominoes to a Vatican III, and that you really do need a Vatican III to finally unravel some of these issues that were brought up in Vatican I?
That's another great question. I suspect that, we have it's very uneven, but if you average it out, we have about one ecumenical council every 100 years. So I've been asked this by students before, if I think if I think there will be a Vatican III, and I always say, I think there will be. I think I will either be a very old man or I'll be dead. And I was born in 1986. But I'm leaving Louisiana, so I might have a longer lifespan because I won't have access to fried shrimp po' boys anymore, as more and amazing fried chicken sandwiches and things. But I think Francis wants synodality. I don't think this. He says it. He's very open about this. He wants synodality to be the normal mode of governing the church, and I find that really interesting because conciliarism, late medieval conciliarism. In the Council of Constance, they passed the decree frequens, where they're trying to have ecumenical councils as the normal mode of governance of the church. Now that would have involved bishops, abbots, and monarchs. Essentially, it wouldn't have involved normal lay people. So Francis is doing something that's, in a sense, it's more radical than conciliarism, because it's involving, theoretically, it's involving women, it's involving laymen, it's involving women religious, it's involving the whole people of God. However, it doesn't have any sort of formal legislative or jurisdictional authority. And that's why your question about Vatican III is really interesting, because if there's, several decades of kind of synodal, discernment, consultation, whatever word you want to use, and then this development of doctrine, this sort of the fruit that comes from this is then debated and potentially made put onto a kind of official juridical level at Vatican III. That's certainly a possibility. If there is a Vatican III, I also think it'll be the first council in a millennia at least where there's a truly kind of global participation. So in the sense that even at Vatican II, it was global, but most of the major theologians were European, or they were educated at European universities. So that if Vatican III, Manila, Lagos, these places could be just as important as, Salamanca or Leuven or something like that. So that would be a fascinating dynamic. And maybe Francis is anticipating that. And that's one reason why synodality and a kind of global decentralized participation is so important to him.
Well, I want to thank you so much for your time. You've been extremely generous. If people want to learn more about you, want to read maybe some of your articles or books, or maybe are there books or resources that maybe you could share for people to learn more about these topics?
Sure. Yeah. So I have a page on academia.edu. So if you just Google my name or search academia.edu, you can see a list of some of my publications. I've written several articles on these themes with Notre Dame's Church Life Journal. So I've written on Jansenism, Vatican I, Vatican II, Pope Francis, some of this stuff. If you're a real church history nerd, my book, The Synod of Pistoia and Vatican II, could be of interest. but it's fairly dense. And then I have this much more digestible and very short overview of Vatican II that I've just co-written with Stephen Bolivant. That's called Vatican II: A Very Short Introduction. So that could be a place where someone who's just kind of interested in this stuff as a side thing might enjoy reading.
Well, thank you again, and we will definitely talk to all of you next time.
Thanks so much, Steve.